Today, we're breaking down a recent press conference that paints a pretty stark picture of Australia's fuel security. The main argument? That the nation is right on the brink of a really serious challenge. So, let's dive into the core issues. Yeah, right from the start, the tone is, well, it's anything but calm. This quote right here sets the stage, framing the problem not as some distant issue, but as an immediate and urgent crisis that's happening right now. So, where does this feeling of crisis actually come from? Well, the first major point of vulnerability that was raised is the nation's critically low strategic fuel reserves. And the comparison here is pretty striking. You see, the international standard, which Australia has agreed to, is a 90-day supply of fuel. But the source claims Australia isn't even meeting that. Then, when you look at a country like Japan, which is reportedly holding 200 days' worth, well, that gap in preparedness becomes really clear. This isn't a problem that just popped up overnight. The next part of the argument looks at the long-term decline in Australia's own ability to produce fuel. It's really a story of shrinking domestic capacity. I mean, this slide really says it all. 2. That's how many oil refineries are reportedly left operating in the entire country. That one single digit is absolutely central to understanding the nation's exposure to any kind of supply chain disruption. And to put that number 2 into perspective, the press conference highlighted that Australia used to have 10, maybe even 12 refineries. So the journey from a dozen all the way down to just 2, it shows a dramatic, decades-long shift away from producing our own fuel. Okay, so this isn't just some abstract national problem. This vulnerability has a very real, very immediate impact right on the ground. The focus now shifts to the independent suppliers, the ones who are feeling that financial pressure first and hardest. And it's such a critical question, right? When supply gets tight and costs are skyrocketing, it's not the major corporations, but the independent distributors, especially those servicing regional areas, who find themselves on the front line of this whole thing. And here is a number that makes the problem incredibly tangible: $250,000. Think about that. That's roughly the upfront cost for a single tanker of fuel. For a smaller independent distributor, that is a massive amount of cash that they just might not have on hand. So what you get is this crucial domino effect. The independents can't afford the fuel, and the source claims the major companies aren't giving them any credit, which puts these smaller businesses at serious risk of going under. And that squeeze on supply, it ultimately hits all of us, from farmers to delivery trucks to, you guessed it, the price you and I pay at the pump. So when you're faced with a situation like this, the conversation naturally turns to, okay, what do we do about it? The proposals that were discussed range from government financial support all the way to the far more drastic and, let's be honest, controversial idea of rationing. Okay, so 3 key actions were put on the table. First, for the government to financially back or underwrite independent distributors just to keep them afloat. Second, to actually sit down and listen to what these independents have to say. And third, to impose penalties on major corporations that are big enough to actually change their behavior, not just something they can write off as a cost of doing business. But if things get worse, the source points to an existing act that actually outlines the priorities for rationing. And the logic is pretty clear. First, you fuel the farms that produce the food. Makes sense. Second, you fuel the trucks that deliver that food. And third, you fuel all the other essential services that keep the country running. And this brings us to a major social friction point that was raised. The idea that people should just work from home to save fuel, well, it's presented as a solution that completely ignores a huge part of the workforce. This slide just lays out the divide perfectly. For a white-collar worker in a city with public transport, yeah, working from home might be a totally viable option. But for the people who are essential to that food supply chain we just talked about, truck drivers, farm workers, meat processors, or police officers for that matter, working from home simply isn't possible. And this rhetorical question really just hammers the point home, doesn't it? It's designed to challenge the simplicity of a one-size-fits-all solution, arguing that it creates this fundamental divide between those who can log on from their living room and those who physically have to be on the road, in the fields, or on the beat. So, all of this brings everything into sharp focus. We've walked through the arguments, the dwindling reserves, a fragile supply chain, and the social fault lines that appear when things get tough. The press conference leaves us with this final, lingering question. And it's a profound one. When resources become scarce, who gets to decide what and who is truly essential?